to a house across the street and laid upon a bed in a small room. Mrs. Lincoln followed, tenderly cared for by Miss Harris. Rathbone, exhausted by loss of blood, fainted and was taken home. Messengers were sent for the cabinet, for the Surgeon General, for Dr. Stone, Mr. Lincoln's family physician, and for others whose official or private relations to the President gave them the right to be there. A crowd of people rushed instinctively to the White House, and bursting through the doors, shouted the dreadful news to Robert Lincoln and Major Hay, who sat together in an upper room. They ran downstairs, and as they were entering a carriage to drive to 10th Street, a friend came up and told them that Mr. Seward and most of the cabinet had been murdered. The news seemed so improbable that they hoped it was all untrue, but on reaching 10th Street, the excitement and the gathering crowds prepared them for the worst. In a few moments, those who had been sent for and many others were assembled in the little chamber where the chief of the state lay in his agony. His son was met at the door by Dr. Stone, who with grave tenderness informed him that there was no hope. The President had been shot a few minutes after 10. The wound would have brought instant death to most men, but his vital tenacity was remarkable. He was, of course, unconscious from the first moment, but he breathed slow and regular respiration throughout the night. As the dawn came and the lamplight grew pale, his pulse began to fail, but his face, even then, was scarcely more haggard than those of the sorrowing men around him. His automatic moaning ceased. A look of unspeakable peace came upon his worn features, and at 22 minutes after 7 he died. Stanton broke the silence by saying, "Now he belongs to the ages." Booth had done his work efficiently. His principal subordinate, Payne, had acted with equal audacity and cruelty, but not with equally fatal result. Going to the home of the Secretary of State, who lay ill in bed, he had forced his way to Mr. Seward's room on the pretext of being a messenger from the physician with a packet of medicine to deliver. The servant at the door tried to prevent him from going upstairs. The Secretary's son, Frederick W. Seward, hearing the noise, stepped out into the hall to check the intruders. Payne rushed upon him with a pistol, which missed fire, then rained blows with it upon his head, and grappling and struggling, the two came to the Secretary's room and fell together through the door. Frederick Seward soon became unconscious and remained so for several weeks, being perhaps the last man in the civilized world to learn the strange story of the night. The Secretary's daughter and a soldier nurse were in the room. Payne struck them right and left, wounding the nurse with his knife, and then, rushing to the bed, began striking at the throat of the crippled statesman, inflicting 3 terrible wounds on his neck and cheek. The nurse recovered himself and seized the assassin from behind, while another son, roused by his sister's screams, came into the room and managed at last to force him outside the door, not, however, until he and the nurse had been stabbed repeatedly. Payne broke away at last and ran downstairs, seriously wounding an attendant on the way, reached the door unhurt, sprang upon his horse, and rode leisurely away. When surgical aid arrived, the Secretary's house looked like a field hospital. 5 of its inmates were bleeding from ghastly wounds, and 2 of them, among the highest officials of the nation, it was thought might never see the light of another day, though all providentially recovered. The assassin left behind him his hat, which apparently trivial loss cost him and one of his fellow conspirators their lives. Fearing that the lack of it would arouse suspicion, he abandoned his horse, instead of making good his escape, and hid himself in the woods east of Washington for 2 days. Driven at last by hunger, he returned to the city and presented himself at Mrs. Surratt's house at the very moment when all its inmates had been arrested and were about to be taken to the office of the provost marshal. Payne thus fell into the hands of justice, and the utterance of half a dozen words by him and the unhappy woman whose shelter he sought proved the death warrant of them both. Booth had been recognized by dozens of people as he stood before the footlights and brandished his dagger, but his swift horse quickly carried him beyond any haphazard pursuit. He crossed the Navy Yard bridge and rode into Maryland, being joined very soon by Harold. The assassin and his wretched acolyte came at midnight to Mrs. Surratt's tavern, and afterward pushed on through the moonlight to the house of an acquaintance of Booth, a surgeon named Mudd, who set Booth's leg and gave him a room, where he rested until evening, when Mudd sent them on their desolate way south. After parting with him, they went to the residence of Samuel Cox near Port Tobacco, and were by him given into the charge of Thomas Jones, a contraband trader between Maryland and Richmond, a man so devoted to the interests of the Confederacy that treason and murder seemed everyday incidents to be accepted as natural and necessary. He kept Booth and Harold in hiding at the peril of his life for a week, feeding and caring for them in the woods near his house, watching for an opportunity to ferry them across the Potomac. Doing this while every wood path was haunted by government detectives, well knowing that death would promptly follow his detection, and that a reward was offered for the capture of his helpless charge that would make a rich man of anyone who gave him up. With such devoted aid, Booth might have wandered a long way, but there was no final escape but suicide for an assassin with a broken leg. At each painful move the chances of discovery increased. Jones was able, after repeated failures, to row his fated guests across the Potomac. Arriving on the Virginia side, they lived the lives of hunted animals for 2 or 3 days longer, finding to their horror that they were received by the strongest Confederates with more of annoyance than enthusiasm, though none, indeed, offered to betray them. Booth had, by this time, seen the comments of the newspapers on his work, and bitterer than death or bodily suffering was the blow to his vanity. He confided his feelings of wrong to his diary, comparing himself favorably with Brutus and Tell, and complaining, "I am abandoned with the curse of Cain upon me, when, if the world knew my heart, that one blow would have made me great." On the night of April 25th, he and Harold were surrounded by a party under Lieutenant E.P. Doherty as they lay sleeping in a barn belonging to one Garrett, in Caroline County, Virginia, on the road to Bowling Green. When called upon to surrender, Booth refused. A parley took place, after which Doherty told him he would fire the barn. At this Harold came out and surrendered. The barn was fired, and while it was burning, Booth, clearly visible through the cracks in the building, was shot by Boston Corbett, a sergeant of cavalry. He was hit in the back of the neck, not far from the place where he had shot the President, lingering about 3 hours in great pain, and died at 7 in the morning. The surviving conspirators, with the exception of John H. Surratt, were tried by military commission sitting in Washington in the months of May and June. The charges against them specified that they were incited and encouraged to treason and murder by Jefferson Davis and the Confederate emissaries in Canada. This was not proved on the trial, though the evidence bearing on the case showed frequent communications between Canada and Richmond and the Booth coterie in Washington, and some transactions in drafts at the Montreal Bank, where Jacob Thompson and Booth both kept accounts. Mrs. Surratt, Payne, Harold, and Atzerodt were hanged on August 7. Mudd, Arnold, and O'Laughlin were imprisoned for life at the Tortugas, the term being afterward shortened, and Spangler, the scene shifter at the theater, was sentenced to 6 years in jail. John H. Surratt escaped to Canada, and from there to England. He wandered over Europe, and finally was detected in Egypt and brought back to Washington in 1867, where his trial lasted 2 months and ended in a disagreement of the jury. Upon the hearts of a people glowing with joy of victory, The news of the President's assassination